I discovered the letters were gone on a Tuesday morning in October, when the light through my bedroom window fell pale and cold across the empty drawer where I had kept them hidden for 7 years. They were not love letters, though perhaps that would have been simpler. They were evidence. Correspondence between my late husband's business partners and the banks that had funded his ventures that had failed spectacularly 3 months after his death, leaving me with nothing but his name and the whispers that followed it through drawing rooms across London. I had spent years gathering those letters, piecing together the truth that everyone else seemed determined to bury, that my husband had been defrauded systematically and deliberately by men who now sat in Parliament and dined with my own father. The drawer had been forced open. The lock, a delicate brass mechanism I had installed myself, hung twisted and useless. I stood there in my dressing gown, my hands cold, and felt something shift inside me that had been holding steady for far too long. Someone in this house, my father's house, where I had been forced to return after my husband's estate collapsed, had taken them. And there were only 3 people who knew they existed. My father had made his position clear from the beginning. You will not speak of this, Constance. You will not pursue this matter. Your husband's failures are his own, and dragging his name, and ours, through further scandal serves no one. But I had not been speaking of scandal. I had been speaking of theft, of criminal conspiracy, of men who had stolen a fortune and left a widow to face society's contempt while they prospered. My stepmother, Eleanor, had been more direct. You sound mad, darling. Obsessed. It's unbecoming. People are beginning to talk. She had said this while pouring tea in the conservatory, surrounded by ferns and orchids she tended with more care than she had ever shown me. Her voice had been soft, concerned, the way one speaks to an invalid who refuses to accept her condition. My half-brother, James, had said nothing at all, but I had seen him watching me, those careful, assessing looks that reminded me he stood to inherit everything our father possessed, and that my continued presence in this house was both an inconvenience and a liability. I had been careful. I had kept those letters locked away, mentioning them to no one outside the family. I had even stopped speaking of my husband's case at dinner, had learned to smile vaguely when asked about my plans, had become the sort of transparent, diminished creature widows were expected to be. And still, someone had decided I was too dangerous to be trusted with the truth. I closed the drawer slowly, then walked downstairs to breakfast. They were all there. My father behind his newspaper, Eleanor examining correspondence, James eating with the focused attention of a young man who never questioned whether the food on his plate was rightfully his. I took my seat. I poured my tea. I buttered my toast with steady hands. "Good morning, Constance," Eleanor said brightly. "You look pale. Are you sleeping?" "Not especially," I said. My father lowered his newspaper just enough to glance at me over the top. "Perhaps Dr. Matthews should call again. Your nerves—" "My nerves are perfectly sound." I met his eyes and watched him look away first. Though I did discover something troubling this morning. Some personal papers of mine have gone missing. Legal documents. Rather important ones. The silence lasted perhaps 3 seconds. Then Eleanor laughed, light and dismissive. "Oh, darling, you know how forgetful you've been lately. I'm sure they'll turn up." They were locked in a drawer. The lock has been broken. James set down his fork. My father's newspaper crackled as his grip tightened. "This is exactly what I mean," my father said quietly. "This obsession, this paranoia, it's consuming you, Constance. Perhaps Eleanor is right. Perhaps it is time we considered a rest cure, somewhere quiet, somewhere you might recover my sanity, I said. Is that what you were going to say, Father? He folded his newspaper with exaggerated patience. I'm trying to help you. We all are. But if you continue down this path, making wild accusations, disturbing the household... I haven't made any accusations, I said. I've simply stated a fact. My documents are missing. Someone took them. Eleanor reached across the table and patted my hand with cool fingers. We're only worried about you, darling. You've been through so much. Grief can make us see conspiracies where there are none. I looked down at her hand on mine, at the rings she wore, diamonds and sapphires, gifts from my father's fortune. The same fortune my husband's supposed failures had never threatened because my father had quietly extricated himself from their partnership months before the collapse. I had found a letter confirming this too. It had been in the drawer. Of course, I said softly. You're right. I'm sure I've simply misplaced them. I saw relief flicker across all three faces. They thought I had surrendered. They thought this performance of concern and control had worked, as it always had before. I finished my breakfast in silence, then excused myself to write letters. But I did not write to doctors or lawyers. I wrote to Mr. Thomas Hartley, editor of the London Chronicle, a newspaper my father despised for its habit of printing inconvenient truths about inconvenient people. And I wrote from memory, because I had read those stolen letters so many times that I could reproduce them nearly word for word. I began with the earliest one, dated March 1878, in which Lord Ashworth, my husband's senior partner and my father's dear friend, had written to his banker about the Bradford situation and the necessity of allowing certain investments to fail before extracting our principal. I continued with the subsequent letters, each one building a meticulous picture of fraud, of deliberate mismanagement, of a scheme designed to bankrupt my husband while enriching his partners. I included names. I included dates. I included amounts. And I included my own affidavit, signed and witnessed, attesting to the authenticity of the documents and my possession of the originals that had now been stolen to prevent exactly this disclosure. I sealed the letters and walked to the post office myself. My maid would have done it, but I wanted no possibility of interference. I wanted to feel the weight of them leaving my hands. Then I returned home and waited. The first article appeared 4 days later. Not on the front page. Mr. Hartley was too clever for that. But on page 5, beneath a headline that read, "Questions arise over Bradford investment collapse." It was carefully worded, legally prudent, but the implications were clear. A widow had come forward with allegations of fraud. Documents existed. An investigation might be warranted. My father read it at breakfast. I watched the colour drain from his face. This is... He couldn't finish the sentence. His hands shook. Eleanor reached for the newspaper and gasped when she read it. James looked at me. Just looked. His expression somewhere between horror and grudging respect. "How could you?" my father said finally. His voice was barely a whisper. "How could you do this to us?" "I didn't do anything to you," I said calmly. I told the truth. I would have told it privately, through proper channels, if I had been allowed to, if my evidence hadn't been stolen. But someone in this house decided that silencing me was more important than justice. "You've destroyed us," Eleanor said. Her voice was rising, losing its cultured veneer. "Do you understand that? Your father's reputation, James's prospects. My husband's reputation was destroyed, I said. His prospects ended when he died believing he had failed, when in fact he had been deliberately ruined. And no one cared. No one thought his name was worth defending. Only yours mattered. Only your comfort, your position, your precious respectability. "We took you in," my father shouted. He was standing now, gripping the edge of the table. "We gave you a home when you had nothing." "You gave me a cage," I said. "And when I tried to speak, you called it madness. When I sought justice, you called it obsession. When I gathered evidence, you stole it. What did you expect me to do? Accept it. Disappear quietly. Become the sort of convenient widow who asks no questions and makes no trouble." The second article appeared 2 days later. This one included quotes from other investors who had suffered similar losses. Mr. Hartley had been busy. The Chronicle's lawyers had reviewed everything carefully. Names were named. Lord Ashworth was asked for comment. So was my father. He refused to speak to me after that, neither did Eleanor. They moved through the house like ghosts, pale and furious, receiving callers who came to ask questions they couldn't answer. James left for his club and stayed there, but the letters kept coming. Other newspapers picked up the story. Questions were asked in Parliament. The banks began internal reviews, and slowly, methodically, the same men who had once dismissed my husband as a failure and my inquiries as hysteria found themselves facing public scrutiny they could not escape. Lord Ashworth resigned from his committees. My father withdrew from society, claiming ill health. Eleanor stopped receiving, and I sat in my room, writing more letters, providing more documentation, watching the architecture of their respectable world crack and crumble under the weight of truth they had worked so hard to suppress. The inquiry was announced in November, a formal investigation into the Bradford investments and related partnerships. My testimony would be required. So would my father's. So would Lord Ashworth's. I was no longer invited to family dinners. That was perfectly fine. I took my meals alone and slept better than I had in years. The trial, because it became a trial, lasted 3 weeks. I sat in the gallery and listened to lawyers pass the same letters I had memorised, watched judges examine the same documents I had once kept locked in a drawer, heard witness after witness confirm what I had known all along, that my husband had been defrauded, deliberately and systematically, by men who had trusted their reputations to protect them from consequence. Lord Ashworth was found guilty of criminal fraud. 2 of his associates were implicated. Significant fines were levied. Restitution was ordered. Not enough to restore what had been taken, but enough to prove I had been right. My father was not charged. His involvement had been peripheral, strategic withdrawal rather than active fraud. But his name appeared in every newspaper report. His reputation, which he had valued above my husband's life and my peace, was permanently tarnished. He would never recover his standing. Society had long memories for this sort of scandal. I did not attend the sentencing. I had already left my father's house, using the initial restitution payment to secure a modest flat in Bloomsbury. It was small, plain, nothing like the grand homes I had known. But the locks worked. The air felt lighter. And when I woke each morning, I could see the sky. Eleanor wrote to me once, a brief, bitter letter accusing me of destroying the family out of spite. I did not reply. James sent a note months later, stilted and formal, saying he hoped I was well and that perhaps in time we might speak again. I considered it, then decided perhaps I would. He had been young after all. He had done what was expected of him. Perhaps he had even learned something. My father never wrote. I heard he sold the London house and moved to Bath, where no one knew him well enough to ask questions. I felt nothing when I learned this. Not satisfaction, not guilt. Just a quiet, distant acknowledgement that he had made his choices, and I had made mine. I spent the following year working with a solicitor to establish a small fund for widows in similar circumstances, women whose husbands had died under suspicious financial circumstances, women who had been told to be quiet and accept their fates. It was not a large fund. It helped perhaps a dozen women, but it existed, and that mattered. I never remarried. I was asked, occasionally, by men who found the story of the widow who had exposed a scandal rather romantic. I declined politely. I had learned too much about the ways power could be wielded and truth could be suppressed within even the most respectable marriages. I preferred my freedom, my small flat, my work. Sometimes on clear evenings I would sit by my window and think about the morning I had discovered the empty drawer. I would remember the cold sweep of realisation, the way something had shifted and settled inside me. Not rage, precisely. Not even vindication. Just clarity. Just the recognition that silence was a choice, and I had chosen differently. They had burned my letters to protect their names. So I had given those letters to the world, and let the world decide whose name deserved protection. In the end, justice had not come from the law, though the law had eventually followed. It had come from the simple, deliberate act of refusing to be silenced, of insisting that truth mattered more than comfort, more than reputation, more than the fragile peace of a household built on lies. I had taken the instruments available to me, ink, paper, memory, and one editor brave enough to print what others would not, and I had used them not for cruelty, but for restoration. Not to destroy, but to reveal what had always been there beneath the veneer of respectability, the rot, the theft, the casual certainty that some people's suffering simply did not matter. And when I looked back at the woman I had been that October morning, standing in her dressing gown before an empty drawer, I felt something like tenderness for her. She had not known yet what she was capable of. She had not known that she contained within herself enough resolve, enough precision, enough quiet fury to dismantle the entire architecture of silence that had confined her. But she had learned, as I had learned. And the lesson had been this: that sometimes the most powerful form of revenge is simply the truth, spoken clearly at the exact moment when everyone expects you to remain quiet. They had tried to erase me. They had tried to make me disappear into the narrative they preferred, the grieving widow too fragile to be believed, too emotional to be trusted with facts. And I had refused. I had insisted on being seen, on being heard, on mattering. That, in the end, was my revenge. Not their downfall, though it came. Not their disgrace, though they earned it. But my own restoration. My own voice, reclaimed from the silence they had tried to impose. I had been erased once. I had allowed it, perhaps, in the fog of grief and exhaustion. But when they tried to erase me a second time, I had refused. And in refusing, I had discovered that I was not, after all, the sort of woman who could be made to vanish. The newspapers had printed every word, and the words had been enough.